All right, now we're getting into persuasion or argument. So let's be clear about an argument is not information. It includes information, but sometimes when I might assign an argument paper or a persuasive paper, sometimes students think they can just use the evidence to argue for them, and that the reader or listener, the reader, will take that evidence into account and come to his or her own conclusion. But let's be clear, you, the writer, the student, must make the argument not just by presenting facts and statistics and evidence, but also by making those connections between the facts and statistics and evidence. You've got to supply the claim and evidence and reasoning. So let's make sure we understand that first of all. An argument really is an attempt to persuade someone to agree or disagree maybe with a debatable claim. The arguer, the writer, the speaker may start with the claim, may open with the claim, or have the claim somewhere very close to the beginning, as like either the beginning of the introduction or the end of the introduction. But sometimes, depending on the style of argument, the claim may come at the end of the paper. But if it's a long paper, it might be really hard to follow. So my advice certainly to you as a student is to have your claim up front somewhere in the introduction of the paper. Introduction usually is the first paragraph, depending on how long the paper is. Sometimes a very long paper, the introduction may take a couple of paragraphs. But as a rule of thumb, let's say you should have one introduction paragraph, and your claim should either come in the very beginning of that or at the very end of your first paragraph. I think and my advice to you really is to build up to that claim within your first paragraph and to state the claim explicitly at the end of your first paragraph. In order to prove or prove to the listener or reader, or to convince the listener or reader, you would need to have evidence, of course. So evidence is one form of support. Support really comes in the form of evidence like facts and statistics, even expert testimony if you are citing a source, and other things. But support is also the reasoning. So you make those connections between the evidence and the claim with reasoning, and examples are proven through explanation. Your explanation is your reasoning. So some of the things you might bring into an argument as support would be, let's say you might cite some experiments that have been made. So you do some research and supply some of the research conclusions or some of the events that took place in the research. But there's researchers out there for most topics that have researchers have already conducted research, and what you might do is just use it as evidence, as evidence to show support for your claims. You might, like I've said already, expert testimony is great. So either you've done research and found that expert testimony in other places like interviews, or even in some books or online journals, scholarly journals, or wherever. Or you could even possibly conduct those interviews yourself. But again, be careful. You should be interviewing people who are who essentially they have the authority to speak on the subject. So don't just interview anybody. Don't just pick out random students. You want to pick out, if they're students, you want students who really know the subject. But ideally, not students at all. Really, people in the field that you're researching, people that are already experienced and have years of experience dealing with the subject matter that you are researching. You might also find some historical evidence in places, books, online sources possibly. All right, and you also could, excuse me while I think for a moment. Keep in mind that when you do this research at the college level, you should be using scholarly journals in much of the research. For the most part, scholarly journals are better accepted than magazine articles, even though some of these magazines that we see today, they look like they're legitimate, and they are legitimate, but they're just, it's very surface level stuff in those magazines, like Newsweek or even the New York Times, or even newspapers and other sources like that. They're just scratching the surface. So if you want some real research to support your claims, then you should be going to these online scholarly sources. If the college that you're at is using EBSCOhost, that's a great one. I'll just go ahead and recommend that. EBSCOhost, it uses a variety of online scholarly journals. It's sort of like a major search engine for scholarly sources. So check with the library on using that source for some high quality scholarly evidence they're peer reviewed. So when they peer review these sources, that is their peers, people also in the same field, they check their work basically, and when they have mistakes before it's published, they address these mistakes. They say to the writer, they tell them what they need to work on clarifying or fixing, and then they have to send it back as many times as it takes until it's worthy of a scholarly published journal. Okay, so do that. Okay, so as I said before, we're talking about argument or persuasion. So not information. You're not just explaining things. You're persuading to a point of view. So let me give you a couple of examples of some thesis statements. So of course your claim is going to come in the form of a thesis. So if your thesis is just informative or explanatory, that's not going to cut it for this paper, not for a persuasion paper. So this is an example of a informational or explanatory thesis. Cell phones make it possible for us to always be within reach, though many people do not always want to be within reach. Of course, it does make it possible for us to reach others easily, and of course, some people don't like that. So that's just information. It's not persuasion. Let me give you an example of a persuasive thesis. Cell phones have ruined our ability to be isolated, to be willfully out of touch with the rest of the world. So that's something that would need to be proven. That the fact, or not the fact, the opinion that cell phones have ruined our ability to be out of touch, to be isolated, and not to be bothered, and so forth. That would need to be argued with evidence and explanation and reasoning and so forth. Okay, I'll give you another example of a good thesis statement, and give you some examples of some support that might be used in that, in proving that thesis statement. High school students should be restricted to 2 hours or less of television viewing. That's a claim. That's the thesis statement. Some support might be that there's a new study and the testimony of educational specialists that reveal that students who watch more than 2 hours of TV per night, on average, have lower grades than those who watch less than 2 hours of TV per night. All right, so using evidence. Now, of course, that would have to be explained. It would have to be, or at least returned to the claim. So then you might follow that with, well, the conclusion is excessive TV viewing adversely affects academic performance. All right, so it's sort of like repeating the claim. And then, you know, it seems pretty apparent from the evidence that is obvious. So let me also point out that sometimes your evidence is not clear enough by itself and needs to be explained, and you need to make those connections between the evidence and the claim. So you need to explain how this evidence is really relevant sometimes, most of the time I should say. But you definitely need a claim, you need evidence, you need some reasoning, and you return to your claim. And anyway, in a nutshell, that is what we're doing here in this argument paper. We're going to be doing it'll be a synthesis, so you're going to be using multiple sources. If it's a synthesis where I supply the sources, then you'll be using the sources that I supply. In some cases, a synthesis is a research paper, and that just means you get your own sources. So you will do the research on your own in some cases. Either way, when you do your synthesis, remember to cover one subtopic at a time. So, okay, yes, you have your main thesis, your big claim that you're going to prove, but you'll also have some supporting claims, basically some other opinions that help support your main opinion. Well, and you need to have those organized and focused so they go one at a time. So you have your main thesis in your introduction, and then you're going to have, let's say, point A, point B, and point C as your subclaims. After point A, you're going to need to have evidence from both sides of the argument, and you're going to have to explain how your evidence and your side of the argument is more valid than the evidence and reasoning of the opposing argument. If you're going to do a good job, you are going to bring light and I shouldn't say that maybe, but make it known that there is an opposing argument. Make it known what the opposing argument is, but make it known and show and explain and reason out why your argument is better. So you do that for point A first. So you will, within one section of your paper, of the body of the paper, you'll need to, of course, you start with your claim, and then you'll show the opposing argument, and you'll show your argument and why it's better. So you'll need sources from both sides of the argument. You should have a balance between sources from both sides of the argument. So you should have, if you have two sources for your side of the argument, then you, in order to not show that you're biased, then you should have two sources from the opposing side of the argument. You should have some balance. It's just that your side of the argument needs to be stronger. I mean, if it's not stronger, you should be siding with the other side. So if it's not better and more reasonable, if your evidence isn't better and your argument more reasonable, then of course you should be on the other side, if you have the choice, right? Okay, so then point B, you similarly will do the same thing. You will have an equal balance between opposing argument and your argument, sources from both sides, and you will show what the opposing argument believes and why, and then you will show what your argument believes, or what you believe and why, with your evidence and your reasoning. And then you will go through that with your point C. And if you have a point D and a point E and so forth, that's great. It depends on how much evidence you're going to bring into this paper, how long your paper is supposed to be. If it's a 5 to 7 page paper, you might have, let's say, 5 or 6 body paragraphs, and so you would need 5 or 6 subpoints perhaps. If it's a shorter paper, like a 3 to 5 page paper, then you might have less. And if it's longer, of course, you might have more. But let's see. You need a balance between sources. You also need balance between evidence and reasoning. So you don't want to have all of your, or most of your, you don't want to have most of your argument based on evidence and not have enough reasoning and support in terms of logic. You need to have about an equal amount of both. That should be about it for this video. So I hope this helps with you and your writing, and good luck.